Hello and welcome to a new video. While I reviewed games from TCEC, CCC 10 advanced to the semi-final phase, and this is now game 16 from there, played between Leela and Houdini. And we have a Sicilian defense, and here after e4 and c5, knight f3, we have d6, which is the most popular second move in the Sicilian, because it guards the e5 square and allows knight f6 with pressure on e4. We'll see immediately why is this important. And here now the game continued with d4. White is expanding in the center. Black takes on d4. He intended to give up this flank pawn for white's central pawn and get a majority in the center. But for this pawn now, after knight takes on d4, white gained the semi-open d file where he can put pressure on d5 and d6. The game now continued with knight f6, attacking e4 and pretty much forcing knight c3 here. This is an important move for black, because if he plays g6, for example, then white can play c4 and enter a Marozzi bind structure with a very strong bind on the d5 square, making black's life of getting in e6 and d5 much more difficult. In the open Sicilian, since this d file is semi-open, white will put a lot of pressure on d5 and d6, and in order to equalize the game, black would like to play e6 and d5. If he manages to get in d5 in good conditions, then he pretty much got rid of his weaknesses and black is fine. So here is very important to play knight f6 and force knight c3, because now c4 can't happen and the game will be much more dynamic, exactly what Najdorf and Dragon variation players would like to get. Bishop d3 defending e4 is also possible, but this bishop now blocks the queen's view of the d5 square and it alleviates the pressure on the d file. Bishop d3 doesn't mix well with white's plans. However, bishop d3 was played one move later in this game, and we'll see there why is this a good move. Here now, after knight f6 and knight c3, black needs to think about the development of his pieces, what to do with this dark squared bishop, because this knight is already developed. This knight can go to c6 or d7. The bishop also has some squares. But what about this one? The dark squared bishop has basically two choices. It can either go to g7 or e7. Now, if black plays g6, then with the development of this bishop to this long diagonal, we get into a dragon variation of the Sicilian, which is very, very popular. But against the dragon, white usually employs the Yugoslav attack, which is very similar to the English attack, with ideas like bishop e3, f3, queen d2, long castles, and then attack black with the g and h pawns. And by playing g6, this pawn is now one step closer to the white army, and this now allows white to engage the black pawns a bit quicker and try to open the h file for the attack. So the other option for black is to develop the bishop here. So now the question is what to do with this e7 pawn. Playing e6 is of course possible, and it leads to Scheveningen structures, but that blocks in this bishop. So in the Najdorf, people want to play dynamically, so they usually develop this pawn to e5, not blocking this bishop and also chasing this knight away from this very strong central square with tempo. However, e5 in this position doesn't quite work yet, because white has bishop b5, and if white manages to exchange the light squared bishops, then white gets a positional advantage. This might seem counterintuitive. Why is exchanging a piece that can attack a weakness for a piece that can defend it be beneficial for the attacker? Well, it is, because imagine if white exchanges all of minor pieces for black's minor pieces and also the queens, then white can still take advantage of the weakness on d5 by occupying it, for example, with a rook. And white can also double the rooks and attack this weakness on d6, while it's much harder to defend d5 with the rooks, because you have to do it laterally, and it's much more difficult to do that. So actually, even though it may seem counterintuitive, exchanging pieces that can defend the weakness with pieces that can attack that weakness is beneficial for the attacker. And here now, after bishop b5, so after knight f6, knight c3 and e5, if bishop b5 and white manages to exchange these bishops, then after knight e2, which is the strongest move here for white, immediately looking at this weakness, after bishop e7, for example, white can go further with the same idea and also remove this knight, which is also defending this weakness. And if white emerges with a strong knight on d5 against a weak bishop on f6, then that's a positionally much better game for black. For example, white could exchange a pair of knights and then park this knight on d5, and then the play against the weak and bad bishop on f6 is very much in white's favor. Alright, so e5 doesn't quite work yet. If after bishop b5 black blocks with the knight, then white has knight f5, and this knight is a monster here. So e5 doesn't quite work yet. That's why in the Najdorf, black plays here a6 first to take away b5 not only from the bishop but also from the knights. And now in this position, white has many ideas. Probably the sharpest is bishop g5. This leads to some really crazy lines in the Sicilian. But the most popular move is the English attack with bishop e3. White's plan, White's very typical attacking plan here, is to play queen d2 long castles and then play f3, not only to defend the e4 pawn and the square, but also to help advancing the g pawn and the h pawn and then attack the black kingside structure. However, in this game we have bishop d3, which is much less played, and this is also the end of the book. It's much less played because it blocks this queen, but it has its points. If now black plays e5, then here white can actually play knight f5, because now after d5, if white exchanges everything on d5, then this bishop defends this knight, and white is fine. Whereas in the English attack, if white plays bishop e3, then after e5, knight f5 doesn't work because of d5. And if you take here, then you're hanging your knight, and otherwise black is threatening to get in d4, and this would be a very good position for black. So bishop d3 has its points. However, after e5, knight f5 is not the best choice for white. Best is to play knight e2, and this is exactly what happened in the game. And they are following Nakamura versus MVL in 2017. This knight wants to go to g3, and then white to probe these two weaknesses in black's position. If white can get this knight here and make this bishop take, for example, then this knight on f5 would be a very strong octopus. Now in the game, we have bishop e7, and now castles, and now knight g3 with this idea of maybe parking the knight here at some point, but Houdini shuts that idea down immediately by controlling these two squares. However, this weakened dark squares in black's camp, and Leela immediately played bishop h6 to attack the rook. And after the rook moved, we have now bishop c4. This bishop is going to this juicy diagonal, and it's also controlling the d5 square. We now have bishop c6, immediately negating the effect of that bishop on c4. Leela jumps in with the knight, trying to preserve the bishops. And now after knight takes, bishop takes definitely is possible. Bishop takes, queen takes. White maintains the outpost on d5 and pressurizes the d6 pawn. This is definitely a good idea. But in this game, Leela preferred to take with a pawn and force this bishop back. And now she played f4 trying to weaken this diagonal and also open the f file. And indeed, if now Houdini would have taken here on f4, then queen d4 is already very, very strong. White is threatening mate on g7, and this threat is very hard to meet. Best is bishop f8, trying to exchange this torn bishop here on h6. But even after bishop takes and rook takes, knight e4 is very, very strong, with the idea to get this check from f6 in. And if that knight gets to f6, then this is lights out for black, because the king has to go to this diagonal, and then this knight just chops off everything with the help of this queen giving checks. Probably black would get even mated. So Houdini played here f5 to defend this square with both queen and rook. But after knight d6, white is still much better here. So he takes on f4, not really working yet. Instead we have queen b6 check, also attacking b2 and defending the d4 square, so that now e takes on f4 would be possible. Here now Leela played king h1, and if Houdini would have taken here on b2, then f5 would have been already a very, very strong attack here for white. For example, if black plays here queen d4 to attack this bishop and also threaten to exchange the queens, queen f3 is very, very strong, with the idea to take here and take on f7 and mate on g7. For example, if the queen takes here, then after f takes on g6, this is hard to defend. Black needs to play f6, but now after knight e4 attacking f6, white will just crash through, and white also has g takes on h7 check and so on. White will get to the black king eventually. So queen takes on b2 is not a good idea. Houdini took on f4, and now we have rook takes on f4 with pressure on f7 and f6, and Houdini played here f5 to shield these weaknesses with the f-pawn. The game continued with bishop d3, and Leela is putting a lot of pressure on the f5 square, hinting that she wants to sag there. And indeed, here in this position, Leela was expecting defensive moves like bishop f8, and after bishop takes, play rook f8, defend f5, and then Leela wanted to play at b4 and so on. But Houdini got greedy here and took on b2. And now came rook b1, and after queen e5, Leela sacked the bishop on f5. And now if pawn takes, then queen h5 is very, very strong with pressure on this. White can also play rook f1, and eventually white will crash through. In the game we had bishop takes, knight takes, and now again if pawn takes, queen h5 is very strong. So Houdini preferred to leave the knight on f5 and bring another piece into the defense. But now came knight g7, attacking the rook and also threatening to get to e6 with the knight. For example, if Houdini saves the rook, then knight e6 is very, very strong. After rook takes and bishop takes, the queen has to go. And after queen c3, white has rook b7, attacking these two pieces here, forcing the queen back. And after rook c7 and queen e8, we can see that white has a very strong position here with all kind of threats coming here. So rook f8 is not an option here for Houdini. He played bishop f8. Now if knight e6, then this bishop hangs on h6. So Leela preferred to take the rook. We have rook takes knight, and now rook h4 to defend both the rook and the bishop. Bishop takes, rook takes, knight c5. And now after the smoke cleared, Leela has a rook for a knight. And being up on exchange is enough to win the game. And in this position, Leela now wants to regroup her pieces. She wants to play rook h3, rook f3, then bring the other rook to f1, and combine threats on the f-file with attacks on these queenside pawns. So the game continued with rook h3, and now we have knight e4, threatening multiple forks on f2 and on c3. So Leela moved her queen to get out from both of them, but this now gives up this pawn on d5. However, Leela is sacrificing a pawn here in order to have time to regroup her pieces. And now we have rook f3, h5, a4, rook e7, and now queen b6. The queen is in a very good position to attack all these pawns. Queen e5, rook f1, king g7, and now rook d3, putting pressure on d6. We have d5, and now king g1. The king is getting out of tricks like knight f2, and then if the rook takes, queen e1 might be available at some point, making use of the fact that the king is in a mating net. So we have king g1. The queen is also shielding this diagonal, so white should be okay here. And now after knight d6, we have queen c5, and it looks like Leela is getting back her pawn. Houdini continued with knight f5, and now we have rook takes, queen e3 check, and here exchanging the queens doesn't quite work yet because of this knight e3, forking both rooks. So instead of taking, Leela played king h1 back. Now came h4, rook d1, and now after h3, Leela decided that it's time to exchange the queens, and she took on e3. And tricky Houdini played here now this intermezzo with h takes on g2. And of course, if the king takes here, then knight e3 comes with check, again forking both rooks, so that's no good. But Leela dodged the check with king g1. This pawn can be picked up later. Now after knight e3, Leela can save the rooks by playing rook d7 here. If knight takes here, then rook takes here. If rook takes here, then rook d7 comes with check, and black loses all the pawns. So instead of knight takes, we have rook takes, and now Leela takes the pawn on g2. And now the game continued with Leela trying to get to these black pawns. Houdini is also attacking c2, so that pawn needs to be defended. However, now Houdini also saves the b pawn. And now we have rook d3 trying to exchange a pair of rooks. Top tip here for everyone: if you are down on exchange, then try to stick to your remaining rook, because if you exchange a pair of rooks, then this knight will have a very hard time defending those pawns against the remaining white rook. So keep the rook alive, and that's what Houdini did, played rook c5. And now the game continued with king f2, and Leela wants to come with the king to the queen side and defend these two weaknesses, and later on use the king to attack these pawns. We now have rook c6, king e1, rook c4, rook b3, rook c6, king d1, knight d6, king c1, and we can see that Leela's king is coming to the queen side here. And here now, after a lot of shuffling for about 30 something moves, we get into this position, which looks very similar. And here Leela is intending to advance this pawn and also the king and get to these pawns. We have now here c3, king h4, rook d3, king h5, rook e3, king g6, rook e7. Leela is trying to win this pawn by playing rook e6 or something, but this knight defends very well. It guards the pawn from behind by defending b7, but also defends e6, not allowing Leela to exchange the rooks, so that knight is quite strong. But now we have king c4, the king going and attacking these pawns, and after some more moves, since Houdini is defending very well, trying to get this pawn with the rooks doesn't quite work, so Leela is planning now to advance the c pawn and exchange it for b6, and then this pawn on a5 will be weak and easier to target. So we have now here c4 soon and c5 and those pawns are exchanged, and now the a5 pawn will drop very soon. We have here Leela trying to exchange still the rooks, but of course Houdini doesn't allow that. But now the a pawn dropped, and Leela's task is much easier now. She just needs to advance this pawn and queen it. But by combining threats against the g5 pawn and the king and advancing the a pawn, Leela will get a chance to actually win down the g5 pawn here very soon. And here it is. And now she can also advance Harry, and that's what she's doing. So you can guess which pawn will queen first. Will it be Harry? It looks like it. Finally, one of the rooks gets exchanged, but the knight refuses to take. So now we have Adam going up the board, and eventually Adam scores the touchdown first. And now we have Leela giving up the rook, and then queening Harry, and then giving up Harry, and then giving some checks, winning the knight, and eventually Leela gives up the rook, and eventually mates the black king here in a couple of moves. A very nice win in the bishop d3 line of the Najdorf. Now at the end of the video, I would like to thank you, Mr. Adolf's Tips, for your generous contribution of $50 to my channel. You, sir, are helping me to get this channel going, and hopefully in the future I can also extend my content with more instructional videos like well-explained opening theory, complex endgames, which I recommend for everyone to study if they want to improve fast. I have some links in the description to endgame theory that players should know. I also intend to create a series about learning a new opening through practice by playing online games. And of course the Leela games will also continue. So thank you again, Adolf, for helping me out, and I invite everyone to subscribe to my channel, like and share my videos, and also check out some of the other games. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. Bye bye.